Right now, in Wiener Neustadt, Austria, and in the hands of diamond aircraft dealers across North America, Europe, and beyond, there are brand new airplanes sitting on ramps that nobody is buying. Not because they're bad airplanes, not because Diamond built something that doesn't work. These are genuinely well-engineered machines with real pedigree, real certification histories, and real capability that pilots have respected for decades. They're sitting because Diamond Aircraft just raised their prices by roughly 40% over a relatively short window, and the market looked at those new numbers, looked at what else is available right now, and a significant portion of the buyers who would have written a check quietly started reconsidering their options instead. That's not a rumor floating around on forums. That's what the inventory picture on ramps and in dealer lots is actually telling you if you know how to read it. And today I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened, why it happened, what Diamond's position in the market actually looks like right now, and what it means if you're a buyer, a seller, or anyone trying to understand where this particular corner of general aviation is actually headed underneath all the press releases and airshow appearances. Before we get into it, hit subscribe, because this channel covers the business and financial side of aviation manufacturing, pricing, and market dynamics in a way most aviation content doesn't come close to touching. And if you want to understand what's actually happening in this industry, instead of what the marketing departments want you to believe, you need to be here for the breakdowns coming over the next several months. There's a lot happening right now that deserves serious attention, and this Diamond story is one of the most instructive pieces of evidence about where the whole new aircraft market stands in 2025 and 2026. Subscribe now and let's get into it. Let's start with who Diamond Aircraft actually is, because context matters enormously here, and you need to understand what kind of company we're talking about before the price story makes full sense. Diamond Aircraft Industries has been building general aviation aircraft since the 1980s. The company started in Austria under the Hoffmann brand before becoming Diamond, and over the decades it built a genuine reputation for doing things differently than the American manufacturers who dominated the market. Where Cessna and Piper were building metal fuselages in Kansas, Diamond was working in composite construction, producing sleeker, more aerodynamically efficient airframes that got better fuel economy, had a distinctive look that people either loved or had a strong opinion about, and reflected a European engineering philosophy that valued efficiency and modern construction methods over the familiarity of traditional aluminum builds. Their product line that matters most for this story centers on a few key aircraft. The DA-20 is a two-seat trainer that has found a real home in flight school fleets over the years. Simple, efficient, easy to maintain, genuinely good at what it does. The DA-40 is their four-seat single-engine piston airplane, the one that competes most directly against the Cessna 172, the Piper Archer, and the Cirrus SR-20, and the one that most private buyers looking at a Diamond product are actually shopping. The DA-42 Twin Star brought Diamond into the multi-engine piston space with twin diesel engines and an avionics suite that made it a genuine advanced trainer platform, and it's been remarkably successful in the professional training and surveillance markets as a result. There's the DA-50RG on the higher end, a five-seat diesel-powered retractable that represents Diamond's push into more capable personal transportation territory. And then there's the DA-62, their largest current production airplane, a twin-engine diesel-powered cabin-class aircraft that occupies a genuinely interesting space in the market as a comfortable, capable, fuel-efficient alternative to piston twins, running on traditional avgas. That last detail about diesel is important, and we'll come back to it multiple times, because it is both Diamond's most distinctive competitive advantage and, right now, one of the complicating factors in the price story we're working through today. Diamond has always occupied an interesting market position. They're not Cessna with its enormous dealer network, deep training fleet penetration, and the brand recognition that comes from being the company that taught most of the world to fly in 172s. They're not Piper with its long history of personal transportation airplanes, and they're not Cirrus, which disrupted the four-seat market so completely in the 2000s with the parachute system and aggressive marketing that it essentially created its own buyer category. Diamond occupies a space that their most loyal customers describe as genuinely thoughtful, well-engineered, and distinctively positioned, and their detractors describe as niche, slightly awkward in terms of support network depth, and priced in a way that has always required some justification relative to the competition. That market position context matters, because when you raise prices by 40% on a product that already required buyers to make an active choice to pick it over more familiar alternatives, the effect of that price increase lands differently than it would for a dominant market player with a captive audience. Now let's talk about the price increase itself, because the numbers here deserve to be looked at directly and without softening them. The DA40, Diamond's core four-seat single and the airplane that drives the most comparison shopping against competitors, has seen its pricing move from a range that was already in the upper portion of the four-seat single-engine market into numbers that genuinely require a conversation about what you're getting for the premium. Depending on the configuration and the specific variant, fully equipped DA40s are now landing in price territory that puts them in direct comparison with Cirrus SR22s rather than competing in the more accessible tier they occupied previously. That's a meaningful repositioning, and it's not one that happened alongside a major new feature set or a significant capability upgrade that would give buyers obvious justification for the new numbers. The airplane is better than it was 10 years ago in various refinements and avionics updates, absolutely, but a 40% price increase in a compressed time frame is not something you can fully absorb into incremental improvements and expect buyers not to notice. The DA42, already an expensive airplane given the twin-engine platform and the sophisticated avionics typically installed, has moved into price territory that puts it in a bracket where buyers start having genuinely serious conversations about whether a turboprop makes more sense. When a piston twin starts approaching numbers where the distance to a real turbine-powered aircraft begins to shrink, you've entered a different competitive conversation than the one you thought you were in, and that conversation tends not to go in the direction the piston twin manufacturer wants. The DA62, Diamond's flagship twin-diesel cabin-class airplane, was already one of the more expensive piston twins available by any measure when it left the factory. Its current pricing, after the increases that have been implemented, puts it in a position where the ownership math requires buyers to do a lot of convincing work on themselves to justify new overused, or over alternatives that might cost less and deliver comparable mission performance for their actual flying. The DA50RG sits in a similarly challenging spot, a capable and genuinely attractive airplane that now carries pricing that puts it in a slice of the market where buyers have meaningful choices and where the Diamond badge, however respected it is among enthusiasts, doesn't automatically close the deal at that number. So where did the 40% come from? Because that number doesn't appear out of nowhere. And understanding the contributing factors actually matters for whether this is a story about Diamond making a strategic mistake or a story about Diamond responding to real cost pressures that they may not have had as much control over as anyone would like. The honest answer is that it's both, and in different proportions depending on which cost driver you're looking at. Start with the straightforward manufacturing cost side. Composite construction, which is Diamond's signature, has gotten significantly more expensive over the last several years. The materials themselves are more expensive. The skilled labor required to work with carbon fiber and fiberglass composites to the tolerances required for certified aircraft construction has gotten harder to find and more costly to employ. Supply chain disruptions that started during the pandemic years and haven't fully normalized since have pushed up the cost of components at essentially every level of the build process, from avionics to hardware to raw materials. None of that is unique to Diamond. Every manufacturer building certificated aircraft has faced the same general input cost environment, and it has genuinely pushed production costs up in a way that isn't simply corporate greed wearing a press release. Then there's the certification and regulatory cost side, which is worth spending a minute on because it's less visible, but just as real. Diamond builds and certifies aircraft under both European Union Aviation Safety Agency and Federal Aviation Administration oversight because they sell into both markets and both regulatory regimes require their own processes, documentation, paperwork, and compliance infrastructure. When either regulatory body updates requirements, updates testing standards, or adds approval steps to processes that previously ran smoother, that cost gets absorbed somewhere in the organization and eventually finds its way into the price per unit. The regulatory overhead cost of building certified general aviation aircraft has risen meaningfully across the industry, and for a manufacturer of Diamond's size relative to a Textron or a Piper that can spread those costs across larger production volumes, the per-unit impact of regulatory cost increases is felt more acutely. Liability and product insurance costs. This one gets less attention than materials and labor in most public discussions, but it is a genuine and significant line item in the cost of every certificated aircraft manufactured and sold anywhere in the United States market. Product liability insurance for aircraft manufacturers, covering them against claims related to an aircraft they built potentially being involved in an accident, is expensive in a way that genuinely surprises people outside the industry when they first encounter the numbers. For a company selling aircraft into the American market, those premiums are not negotiable, and they are not small, and they scale in ways that don't always track linearly with the risk profile of what you're actually building. That cost gets passed through into the purchase price of every airplane, and as premiums have risen across the industry, the pass-through has risen with it. Currency and exchange rate dynamics. Diamond builds in Austria. They sell globally, but the American market is critically important to their volumes. They're paying a large share of their production costs in euros and receiving significant revenue in dollars, which means exchange rate movements between those currencies create real margin pressure or relief, depending on which direction things move. Periods of dollar weakness relative to the euro make every airplane sold in the American market effectively cost more to produce in relative terms, and that pressure either gets absorbed as margin compression or gets passed through as price increases. Over the window we're looking at for this 40% increase, currency dynamics have not been uniformly favorable, and that's part of the real cost picture. Add all of that together, and you get a genuine manufacturing cost story that explains, in honest terms, some portion of why prices went up. Costs went up, regulatory burden went up, insurance went up, currency was not always cooperative, some price increase was mathematically inevitable. But here's where the strategic question enters, and it's the part that's actually generating the unsold inventory sitting on ramps right now. Just because costs go up in a way that genuinely justifies some price increase doesn't mean any price increase of any magnitude will be absorbed by the market without consequence. The market sets the ceiling on what buyers will pay, and the manufacturer's cost structure sets the floor on what they can charge. And between those two numbers is where you either have a viable business or you have a problem. What Diamond has run into is evidence that the ceiling may be lower than the new prices assume, and the ramp inventory is the proof. Here's the specific mechanism by which that happens, and it's important to trace it carefully because it's not as simple as price went up, buyers walked away. The used diamond market exists, and it's been growing in available inventory over the last couple of years as some owners who bought during the pandemic era enthusiasm wave have started to reconsider their positions given the broader economic environment and the higher cost of maintaining and operating their aircraft. A used DA-40 in solid condition with a good panel, reasonable engine time, and a clean maintenance history can be found for significantly less than a new one at current pricing, and that gap has widened noticeably as the new price has moved up. A buyer who walks into a Diamond dealership looks at the new DA-40 at its current price and then does any amount of used market research is going to find options that cost $40,000 or $50,000 less for an airplane that does the same mission. Some of those buyers will pay the premium for new because they genuinely value the warranty, the zero-time engine, the current avionics specification, and the peace of mind of factory delivery. But some of them, a meaningful and growing number of them, will decide the gap is simply too wide to justify, and they'll buy the used one instead. That transaction happens off the manufacturer's books entirely. It doesn't help Diamond's revenue, it doesn't move the new inventory, and it leaves another new airplane sitting exactly where the delivery driver parked it. At the same time, Diamond's primary competitors in the four-seat piston market have their own pricing pressures, but they've moved through this environment in different ways, and their price increases, while real, haven't all landed in the same concentrated manner. A buyer comparison shopping between a new DA-40 and a new Cirrus SR-20 or a new Piper Archer finds that the gap in their relative positioning has shifted. Diamond used to occupy a clear space as the efficiency-focused, technically sophisticated alternative that costs somewhat more than the basic training derivatives, but less than the premium Cirrus positioning. That space has gotten harder to define cleanly at the new prices, because the comparison math has moved in ways that make the Cirrus value proposition look stronger, or the Piper value proposition look more sensible for the buyer who wants simplicity, or the used market option look more compelling for the buyer who wants cost efficiency. And then there's Cirrus. We need to talk about Cirrus in this context because the competitive dynamics between Diamond and Cirrus are a big part of the story, whether Diamond's marketing materials acknowledge it or not. Cirrus has spent the last 2 decades building something that is genuinely hard to replicate quickly, which is a brand that buyers in a certain demographic don't just like but actively identify with. The Cirrus SR-22 is not just an airplane to its buyers. It's a signal about the kind of pilot they are, the values they have around safety, and the community they want to be part of. The Cirrus airframe parachute system, whatever your technical opinion of it as an emergency recovery tool, has become so associated with the SR-22's identity that buying one feels qualitatively different than buying an airplane without one, and Cirrus has been masterful at reinforcing that emotional component of the purchase decision in a way that justifies their pricing in their buyers' minds. Diamond has the Dart Trainer program, Diamond has the composite construction, Diamond has the diesel efficiency story, but they do not have the parachute, which is the most visible single differentiating safety feature in the personal aircraft market, and they do not have the same brand identity infrastructure that Cirrus has built over 25 years of consistent, focused marketing. When prices are close, those intangibles can go either way, depending on the buyer. When prices move further apart in Diamond's direction, the intangible Cirrus advantages start pulling more buyers toward the SR range, rather than toward the DA40. Now let's talk about the diesel story in more depth, because it deserves its own careful treatment, and it connects directly to some of the most important parts of the current market situation. Diamond was genuinely ahead of the curve in embracing diesel power plants. The DA42 Twin Star was certified with diesel engines when diesel piston aviation was still a genuinely novel concept, and the fuel story around it was compelling from day one. Burn jet fuel instead of avgas. Access a fuel that's available at virtually every airport in the world, not just the ones carrying aviation gasoline. Get better fuel efficiency per unit of power produced than a comparable gasoline piston engine, and sidestep the entire complicated, politically fraught conversation about leaded aviation fuel and its eventual phase-out. As a strategic bet on where aviation was going, the diesel commitment was not a foolish one. It was in many ways a sophisticated read of where the industry's fuel transition needed to go. But the payoff on that bet has been complicated in ways that matter for selling airplanes right now. The certified diesel piston engine space is dominated by a small number of manufacturers, and the support network, parts availability, and maintenance expertise for these engines, while it has grown meaningfully since the early years of Diamond's diesel models, is still thinner than what you get with a Lycoming or Continental-powered airplane that's been in service for decades and has a mature, deep, widely distributed support infrastructure. A buyer considering a DA42 or a DA62 has to be honest with themselves about where they're going to be flying, where they're going to be maintaining the airplane, and what their options look like if something needs attention somewhere that isn't one of Diamond's dealer or service locations. That's not an insurmountable concern, but it's a real one, and it comes up in the purchase conversation. The availability of diesel fuel at general aviation airports, while not a crisis, is also not as universally seamless as the marketing around Diamond's diesel models sometimes implies. Jet A is widely available, yes, but the specific pumping infrastructure at smaller general aviation airports varies, and a buyer planning to use a DA62 as a personal transportation airplane needs to think through their routine destinations and verify the fuel availability picture at each of them in a way that a Lycoming-powered buyer simply doesn't have to. There's also the engine cost story, which some buyers encounter during their research and which adds complexity to the ownership economics conversation. Turbocharged diesel engines in the aviation context are sophisticated pieces of equipment, and their maintenance and overhaul costs carry their own specific financial character that buyers need to budget for carefully. When you're already looking at a very expensive new airplane purchase, the prospect of discovering that the overhaul economics of the power plant work out differently than you initially modeled can affect how buyers feel about committing to the new price. None of this means Diamond's diesel strategy was wrong. It means that the diesel advantage, which should theoretically be helping Diamond sell airplanes given everything happening with avgas and the GAMI and SWIFT approvals and the general uncertainty around the future of leaded aviation fuel, is not closing deals as cleanly as it should be, partly because buyers in the market for new aircraft have gotten careful and thorough enough in their due diligence that they're asking hard questions about the full ownership picture rather than just accepting the efficiency numbers on the spec sheet at face value. Let's talk about what the inventory situation actually looks like on the ground, because there's a difference between what you can read in a press release and what you can observe by paying attention to what's actually happening at dealer lots and on manufacturer ramps. There are DA40s that have been sitting at dealer locations for months. There are DA42s that have completed their delivery acceptance process and haven't found buyers. There are DA62s in various stages of waiting for a signed purchase agreement that would move them off the lot. The exact numbers aren't publicly disclosed in the way they would be for a publicly traded company with quarterly inventory reporting obligations. But dealers in the Diamond network conversations happening in the general aviation community, and the general observable reality of what's on dealer ramps versus what's actively being delivered to new owners all point in the same direction. The pipeline between factory completion and owner delivery has gotten longer, and the reason it's gotten longer is that the price increase arrived faster than the buyer pool's willingness to absorb it. This matters beyond just being an uncomfortable fact for Diamond's sales team. It matters because of the financial dynamics of carrying unsold inventory. An airplane sitting on a dealer's ramp is capital that's deployed and not generating return. If the dealer financed the airplane's acquisition from the manufacturer on a floor plan arrangement, which is extremely common in aircraft sales, that means there's interest accumulating on that capital while the airplane sits. At some point, the pressure to move the inventory starts to build regardless of whether the headline list price has moved. And that pressure expresses itself in ways that effectively discount the price even when no formal list price reduction has been announced. Dealers start being willing to negotiate on things they wouldn't have touched 18 months ago. Trade-in allowances get more generous. Accessories, training packages, avionics database subscriptions, and extended warranty terms start getting offered as sweeteners that weren't part of the standard deal before. And eventually, if inventory sits long enough, actual price adjustments happen, because the alternative is worse for everyone in the distribution chain. Diamond is aware of this dynamic because they're professionals who have been in this business long enough to know how aircraft market cycles work. The question is how they respond to it, and what levers they actually have available to pull. One lever is marketing. You invest more heavily in telling the Diamond story, in communicating the value proposition clearly, in reaching buyers who might not have fully considered Diamond, and in reinforcing the choice for buyers who were already leaning that direction. This costs money and takes time to produce measurable effects. But it's a real tool, and manufacturers use it. Another lever is configuration and specification adjustment. If fully optioned configurations are sitting and simpler, lower-priced entry points would appeal to buyers who want the Diamond airframe but can't justify the full loaded number. Then you start offering more accessible entry configurations that put the base price in a different psychological bracket. This can work reasonably well, but it requires being honest with yourself about where the market actually is versus where you want it to be, and it can create its own tensions around brand positioning. A third lever is the distribution and dealer network strategy. Are your dealers in the right markets? Do they have the right sales capabilities? Is the support infrastructure in the regions where you need to be selling strongest? Tightening and improving the dealer network is a real investment with real payoff potential. But again, it takes time. And the most uncomfortable lever is price itself, which for a manufacturer that has already moved prices significantly upward in a compressed time frame is a lever that's very difficult to pull back on without sending a market signal that creates its own problems. You don't want to announce a price reduction because buyers who paid the higher number will feel burned. Dealers who have inventory at the old cost basis will need some kind of accommodation, and the market signal of a price reduction in a segment where perception of brand health matters can do damage that takes years to repair. So instead, you do what many manufacturers in this position do, which is manage the actual transaction price through dealer flexibility and sweeteners while maintaining the list price on paper, creating a gap between nominal and effective pricing that serves the immediate sales purpose without triggering all the consequences of a formal announced reduction. Whether Diamond will need to go further than that, whether a formal price adjustment becomes necessary, depends on how long the current inventory situation persists and how the broader market environment develops over the next 6 to 12 months. Let's zoom out from Diamond specifically and situate this in the broader general aviation new aircraft market, because understanding Diamond's situation in isolation misses important context about what's happening across the industry simultaneously. New aircraft prices across virtually every category have moved up substantially over the last 5 or 6 years, and the compounding effect of those increases is now colliding with a buyer population that, while still genuinely interested in aviation, has gotten more careful about major financial commitments as the economic environment has become less uniformly optimistic than it was during the pandemic years when order books were overflowing and wait lists stretched 2 years out. The buyer who exists in the market for a new personal aircraft right now is typically a successful individual, probably a business owner or a senior professional, who has genuinely discretionary income, but who also has multiple ways to deploy that capital, and who has gotten better at asking hard questions about whether a particular purchase makes financial sense when all the operating costs, insurance, hangar, maintenance, and depreciation are properly modeled. That buyer is not going to be moved by enthusiasm alone. They're going to do the math, and in a number of aircraft categories right now, when they do the math, the conclusion points either toward a used option or toward no purchase at all, until the picture gets clearer. The financing environment has added its own layer of complexity. Aircraft loans for new personal aircraft at meaningful price points are priced at interest rates that look different today than they did in 2020 and 2021, when the pandemic-era order surge was happening. A six-figure or even seven-figure aircraft purchase financed at current market rates produces a monthly payment calculation that makes some buyers pause in a way they wouldn't have when rates were lower, and that pause translates directly into longer sales cycles, more deal fall-throughs at the financing stage, and a general slowing of transaction velocity that shows up in inventory accumulation across categories. Insurance, as we've discussed at length in other contexts, has become a genuinely significant factor in whether aircraft purchase transactions actually close. For Diamond's more capable models especially, the DA42 and DA62 in the multi-engine context and the DA50RG in the higher performance single context, insurance underwriting requirements around pilot experience, type-specific training, and endorsements have gotten more involved, and premiums have moved in a direction that surprises buyers who didn't factor those numbers into their initial affordability analysis. When someone does the airplane purchase math without insurance in the model and then discovers that annual insurance adds a meaningful five-figure number to the ownership cost picture, the arithmetic of the whole purchase can shift in an uncomfortable direction. Now let's talk about what this means for several specific categories of buyer who are relevant to this story, because different people are affected by the Diamond pricing situation in very different ways. If you're a flight school operator considering a Diamond product for your training fleet, particularly the DA20 or a DA40 in trainer configuration, the pricing story lands in a specific and somewhat unique way for your situation. Flight school economics are built on utilization, on maximizing hours flown per aircraft per year, and keeping per hour operating costs tight enough that your student pricing is competitive and your margins are livable. A significant price increase in the acquisition cost of training aircraft means your depreciation costs per hour go up, which either gets passed to students through higher rates or gets absorbed as margin compression that makes the business harder to run sustainably. Some flight schools are choosing to keep their existing Diamond fleets flying rather than adding new aircraft at current pricing, specifically because the acquisition economics of adding a new unit at current prices don't pencil out the way they did a few years ago. Others are looking at what comparable training aircraft from other manufacturers are available and whether the Diamond-specific advantages for their operation justify the new price premium. That comparison shopping, at the fleet purchase level rather than the individual buyer level, is a meaningful part of the overall demand slowdown in Diamond's training-focused models. The DA20 specifically occupies an interesting position here because it has been genuinely dominant in certain training fleet segments for legitimate reasons. It's efficient, it handles well for an ab initio trainer, it teaches good habits, and operators who've run them have generally found them reliable and reasonable to maintain. But at current pricing, flight schools that would have previously renewed or expanded their DA20 fleets are now doing harder analysis about whether the cost structure still makes sense, and some of them are landing on answers that don't favor buying new at the prices currently on offer. If you're a private buyer who's been considering a DA40 as your personal four-seat airplane, your comparison shopping landscape has shifted in ways that genuinely matter. The Cirrus SR20, which is the most natural direct competitor in the fully equipped four-seat single category, has its own pricing pressures and has also moved up. But Cirrus has a brand identity infrastructure and a safety narrative with the parachute system that gives them pricing power that Diamond doesn't have in the same degree. The comparison between a fully equipped DA40 and a fully equipped SR20 at current prices involves a shorter gap than it used to, and for some buyers, that means the Diamond choice becomes harder to defend to themselves when the Cirrus is available at a price that's closer and comes with a brand story and resale history that's arguably better understood in the broader market. The used DA40 market, meanwhile, offers buyers a genuine alternative that captures most of what they actually want out of the Diamond product, at meaningfully lower cost. A DA40 from several years back, with good engine time remaining, a solid panel, and clean logs can be found for $50,000 or more below the current new price in many cases, and that gap is wide enough that for buyers who aren't specifically attached to new airplane ownership benefits, the used option is looking increasingly compelling. And then there's the used market from Diamond's actual competitors. A used SR22 or a used SR20 can be found at various price points that create additional comparison pressure. A used Columbia or Corvallis from the same composite construction high-performance piston family that Diamond occupies in buyers' minds offers yet another option. The used market, broadly, has gotten a lot more interesting for buyers at the price points Diamond is now occupying with their new product, and that's not a coincidence. It's a direct effect of the price increase, making the gap between new and used wide enough that the used alternative becomes genuinely attractive in a way it wasn't when the spread was narrower. If you're an existing Diamond owner, the pricing story affects you in a specific way that's worth thinking through carefully. On the one hand, higher new aircraft prices should theoretically support used values, because if the new version of your airplane costs 40% more than it did when you bought yours, the resale value of your existing aircraft should theoretically benefit from the price support at the top of the market. That logic works reasonably well when new aircraft demand remains strong enough that buyers are actually making the comparison between new and used regularly and choosing used as the sensible alternative. The new pricing effectively sets the ceiling that used values are measured against. On the other hand, if new aircraft demand has slowed enough that buyers aren't regularly making that comparison because they've stepped back from the market entirely, the theoretical price support from high new prices doesn't actually show up in what someone will pay for your used airplane, because the reference transaction simply isn't happening at enough volume to anchor the comparison. The used market moves on its own supply and demand dynamics, and if there are more used Diamonds coming to market as some owners decide to exit while other buyers have stepped back from purchasing, the price support you'd expect from high new prices may not fully materialize. This is one of the subtler risks for current Diamond owners in this environment, and it's worth being aware of if you're thinking about your exit timeline from your current airplane. Now let's get into what Diamond's actual response to this situation looks like, or should look like, and where the strategic paths forward lead. Diamond is not a company that's in imminent existential crisis. They've been through market cycles before. They have government support relationships, particularly with the Austrian government and various defense-adjacent and training program relationships globally that provide revenue streams that are somewhat insulated from the civilian personal aircraft market dynamics we've been discussing. Their DA-42 and DA-62 have established positions in specialized surveillance, observation, and training markets, where the buyer is often a government agency or institutional operator rather than an individual private buyer, and those markets follow different dynamics than the personal aircraft market we've been focusing on. But the civilian personal aircraft market matters to Diamond's overall business in ways that can't just be substituted away with institutional and government sales alone. The Diamond brand, the Diamond dealer network, and the Diamond service infrastructure in North America and Europe are built around serving private buyers, flight schools, and small operators, not just institutional customers. If civilian personal aircraft sales stay soft for long enough, those dealer network and service infrastructure investments start to look different, and the manufacturer-dealer relationship, which is one of the key structural assets any aircraft manufacturer has in reaching individual buyers, comes under its own form of stress. So what are the real options on the table? One genuine path forward involves Diamond leaning more aggressively into the segments where their diesel advantage is most obviously compelling right now. If you're a buyer who is actively worried about the future of avgas, whether because you're at an airport where the future of fuel supply is genuinely uncertain, or because you're thinking about flying internationally where avgas infrastructure is thinner, or because you're philosophically committed to not using leaded fuel, Diamond's diesel lineup is a legitimate answer to a real concern that doesn't have another good answer in the certified production piston category. Marketing that tells that story specifically and clearly to the buyers who are actively feeling that concern could pull forward purchases from buyers who are genuinely motivated by the fuel story but haven't been reached effectively. Another path involves making the case for Diamond's composites forward construction approach in terms that connect to what buyers actually care about in 2025 and 2026. The efficiency story, the aerodynamic performance, the modern construction philosophy, these are real advantages that Diamond's airplanes genuinely offer, and in an environment where fuel costs and operating efficiency matter more to buyers who are scrutinizing every aspect of ownership economics, that story should resonate if it's told clearly and specifically, rather than as abstract engineering pride. A third path, and possibly the most immediately impactful, involves looking honestly at the configuration and specification strategy and asking whether the current production mix is serving the actual buyer pool effectively. If there are entry-level buyers who would happily own a well-made diamond product and for whom the core airframe is the value driver, but who are being priced out by the optional equipment packages that have become standard configurations, then creating genuinely accessible entry specifications that put the base price in a more competitive bracket could open up a buyer segment that's currently walking away before the conversation even starts. This is a real trade-off, because fully optioned units generate more revenue per aircraft, and there are real efficiencies in building to a consistent specification. But if the fully optioned configuration is the reason inventory is sitting, adjusting the configuration strategy is worth the analysis seriously, not just as a theoretical exercise. Diamond has also, in recent years, made investments in electric and hybrid electric technology development with the EDA-40 and related research programs. This is a long-horizon investment that doesn't help move the DA-40 sitting on a dealer ramp today, but it matters for understanding where Diamond is positioning itself for the decade ahead. And for buyers who care about the direction an aircraft manufacturer is heading, it's a genuine differentiator. Whether that long-horizon investment pays off depends enormously on factors that nobody can fully predict, including the pace of electric aviation certification, battery technology improvement, and charging infrastructure development. But as a signal about where Diamond's engineering culture is oriented, it speaks to a company that sees itself as a technology-forward manufacturer rather than one simply building variations of what existed 50 years ago. For the right buyer, that matters. Let's talk about the specific numbers in more concrete terms, because it's easy to talk about 40% in the abstract without connecting it to what buyers are actually being asked to spend. A DA-40NG in a well-equipped configuration has moved from price territory that was in the low to mid-200,000s for a base airplane to current pricing that, when equipped the way most private buyers actually want to spec it, lands in the 300,000s and in some configurations meaningfully beyond that. That's a specific, real number that sits next to specific, real alternatives in the market, and the comparison is not flattering when a used SR-22 or a used DA-40 from a few years ago can be acquired for less. The DA-42, Diamond's twin-engine platform, in equipped configuration for a private buyer, is now pricing into territory that starts a serious conversation about single-engine turboprops, particularly used turboprops in the market, which are at a place where some of the more accessible examples of that category start within reach for a buyer who was otherwise going to spend that money on a new twin-piston. That's a meaningful competitive pressure, because the performance advantages of a turboprop over a piston twin, particularly for actual transportation flying, where speed and weather penetration capability matter, are real, and buyers doing serious analysis know it. The DA-62, Diamond's flagship, in full private buyer configuration, is priced at a level where the per-year ownership cost structure, when you add maintenance, insurance, hangar, fuel, and the depreciation on that acquisition price, becomes a number that buyers compare against charter and fractional ownership alternatives, and where the math for lower utilization owners can start to favor the fractional alternative. That's a specific competitive threat that didn't exist at the same intensity at lower price points, and it's worth Diamond taking seriously. Now I want to spend some time on what all of this means in practical terms if you're actually making a decision about Diamond aircraft right now, whether that's buying one, selling one, or managing one. If you're seriously considering buying a new Diamond and the current pricing has given you pause, here's what I'd actually suggest doing, rather than just walking away from the category. Have an honest conversation with a Diamond dealer about what's actually negotiable in the current environment. Not all dealers will negotiate equally, and not all inventory has the same negotiating dynamics attached to it. But an airplane that's been sitting on the ramp for 8 or 10 months is a different conversation than one that just arrived from the factory. Ask directly how long the specific airplane you're looking at has been available for purchase. Ask what the dealer is able to do on the overall package, not just the sticker price, but the included training, the extended warranty terms, the avionics setup and database subscription, the ground handling equipment, whatever items are part of a complete delivery. In the current environment, the total package negotiation is often more productive than trying to move the headline number because dealers have flexibility in ways they didn't 18 months ago. Get the insurance conversation handled before you fall in love with a specific serial number. This is true for any significant aircraft purchase in the current market, but it's particularly true for Diamond's higher capability models. If you're a lower-time pilot considering a DA-42 or a DA-62, find out what your insurance picture actually looks like before you've mentally committed to the purchase, because discovering that your annual premium is $50,000 or $60,000 at the tail end of a purchase process that took months is a genuinely unpleasant experience that can be avoided by making a few calls to aviation insurance brokers at the beginning of the process instead of the end. Underwriters have specific requirements around Diamond multi-engine aircraft that are worth understanding clearly up front, including type-specific training requirements and minimum time in type before solo privileges in some cases. Do the complete ownership cost analysis, not just the purchase price analysis. The acquisition price is the most visible number, and it's where most of the initial sticker shock happens. But the real ownership experience is defined by the totality of monthly operating costs, and those numbers tell a different story depending on how much you actually fly and what your utilization pattern looks like. Diamond's diesel-powered aircraft have genuine operating cost advantages that show up over time in reduced fuel burn, and in markets where avgas costs are high or availability is uncertain, in fuel sourcing flexibility that's genuinely valuable. If you're going to fly regularly and you're going to fly it hard, the diesel efficiency advantage accumulates meaningfully over a few years of ownership. If you're going to fly 60 or 80 hours a year, the efficiency advantage accumulates more slowly, and the acquisition premium needs to be weighed against a smaller annual fuel benefit. Compare seriously against the used market before you commit, even if your preference is new. The used Diamond market has options in it right now that represent genuine value, and knowing exactly what those options are and what they cost gives you important context for evaluating whether the new price premium makes sense for your specific situation. You might conclude that new is absolutely worth it for you, for warranty reasons, for configuration reasons, for the psychological value of knowing the aircraft's complete history from day one. But you should make that conclusion after genuinely looking at the used options, not before. If you're an existing Diamond owner thinking about selling, here's what the current environment actually means for your timing and your expectations. The used market for Diamond aircraft is not in free fall. These are real airplanes with genuine communities of loyal owners, established maintenance networks, and real utility for specific missions. But the demand side of the used market is facing the same headwinds that are affecting the new market, which means buyers are more cautious, sales timelines are longer, and the aggressive pricing assumptions that a seller might have made in a stronger market need to be revisited realistically. An airplane that might have moved in 60 days in 2021 or 2022 may need 120 or 150 days to find the right buyer in the current environment, and that extended exposure time needs to be factored into your planning, particularly if you have a specific timeline in mind for the transition into or out of the airplane. Condition and presentation matter more in a slower market than they do in a hot one